Thanks, Drusilla. Thanks, Rob. I'm going to very quickly go through some points that I hope can be the groundwork for a discussion afterwards. Basically, what Rob's story tells us is what? You had the eruption of the people into the political process in this period, right, across the continent. It took a variety of different forms and different consequences to bring us to a point where, over 100 years later, you could say, well, democracy seems to be consolidated and established across the spectrum of these countries, at least most of them in Western Europe. In much the same way, I'm going to try to suggest that what we're seeing now is indeed a revolution in a discrete subsystem, the Arab world. So a revolution as fundamental as a European precedent. But in the same way, there's going to be a great deal of variation in the way it plays out. And that variation is significant. Maybe not in the cosmic time scale, but very much in the next 100-year time scale. So first, this is a real normative paradigm break. The new concepts that really had never been in play before. The idea of popular sovereignty, of political order as flowing from the will of the people, as being legitimized by the authority of the people. The most common chant in these revolutions is, the people want the regime to fall. Right? This is new, the idea of representation of democracy. I remember in the 1980s, friends of mine in a university in Jordan tried to organize a panel on democracy, and they had a really hard time trying to convince the government authorities, the university administration to allow it, and finally they did, and when they did, and they held the panel, and all the students showed up, right, the first student raised his hand and said, what democracy? We want Islam. Right? So the idea of democracy as the catalyst or the expression of political demands really evolved in the last couple of decades and it's now finally broken out in full force really across the region. So this is a real revolution, but as I said, there's going to be variation. Variation along a number of levels. And in the regimes, for one thing. The outcome in each country is going to be shaped to some extent by the character of the state. Some will survive and try to channel the change along the lines, kind of along Bismarckian lines, hopefully. Others will be completely swept away by it because they won't be able to do so. You have rich regimes and poor regimes, right? Countries that have a lot of revenue at their disposal, which they can buy off. Professor Spolare, I'm sure, will have more to say about this, parts of their populations. Others simply don't have that option. You have monarchies versus one-party regimes. It's beginning to look again, as specialists in the Middle East have noted for a while now, that monarchies seem to have a little bit more of an advantage in riding through these waves of instability because of, the rulers of one-party regimes can't distance themselves from their party. It's a one-party regime. So they can't, like kings, at least pretend to be above the fray and try to mediate between different political currents, or they find it more difficult to do so. And so you see Morocco somewhat more stable than Algeria. I don't want to take this too far because, as I said, all of these countries are undergoing the same fundamental revolutionary wave. But the regime type will matter. The character of the society will matter. The cleavages that exist there. In Bahrain, the fact that what you have is a 30% Sunni dominating a 70% Shia population, this is going to lend a very distinctive cast to the entire political dynamic there. You can't really understand what's going on in Jordan today either, unless you recognize that the Palestinian-Jordanian divide, social divide there as well. Most of the initial wave of unrest against the regime was actually driven by East Bank Jordanians, Transjordanians, and now it's beginning to look like the Palestinian element is also becoming part of it. But that tension between those two communities is going to very much be crucial in the way it plays out in Jordan and in the way that the regime is able to play off different parts of society against each other. You have variation in the opposition movements, and here I think what Rob said is very important in terms of the socialist parties in Europe. The equivalent today would be the Islamist parties in much of the Arab world. It's not simply a question of regimes versus Islamists, that's too simplistic, but I think it is probably the case that the Islamists will continue to be the main opposition force in all of these countries. I don't think there's been a little bit of downplaying, I think, their influence and their power in countries like Egypt. They will be the dominant opposition force. Every successful opposition movement in the Arab world will have to, in some manner, accommodate itself to the Islamic spirit. Some of these will, in fact, as in the Turkish case, stay on the democratic path, tactically figure out that that is their best bet in terms of advancing their agenda. And in many ways, that path will then, as it did with many of these socialist parties in Europe, take them down at what you might call a social democratic or Islamic democratic route that will eventually make them democratic genuinely. Others may not. And so that variation is important as well. Yet another variable has to do with state consolidation and state strength. One of the striking aspects of these uprisings in the Arab world is how in country after country you have the demonstrators, the people coming out, waving their country's flag, singing their country's national anthem, expressions of patriotism that are striking for somebody like me who first gained political consciousness at an era in which public unrest often took a pan-Arab form, in which the legitimacy of these individual state systems was itself called into question. So the fact that we're seeing an assertion of state patriotism, what does that mean? Does it mean the definitive triumph of state sovereignty? Or does it mask what is, after all, a regional dynamic that may yet herald a new transnationalism? For example, a pan-Islamic transnationalism. It's not impossible. Rob's German example, I think, should alert us that the answer is not foregone. Nobody could have foreseen that, that Germany would unite when it did during the past 50 years earlier. So it's not impossible that a Arab unification movement, driven most likely by an Islamic political framework, could yet materialize. There's also the connection between revolutions and interstate wars. Again, as in Europe, political scientists have written about this. Big revolutions tend to be associated with big wars because they threaten neighboring countries, the political order in other countries, and because they, by weakening the state, at least temporarily, invite foreign aggression as well for predatory reasons. Will authoritarian regimes in the Arab world intervene to prevent the spread of revolution? I note that this morning the Saudi troops apparently entered Bahrain in order to help prop up the regime there against its opposition. There is something distinctive here, I think, that's going to also play a role in the variation, which is the role of the United States. The United States does wield influence. It's going to be able to, it's going to, of course, be driven by its own perception of interest, so it's going to be more hostile to the beleaguered regimes in some countries. It's going to be less hostile to them in others. And this will be a factor, though ultimately maybe not a decisive factor. So the path to where we're going will be neither uniform nor necessarily smooth. We can expect excesses on every level. This is a new dynamic, a new era in Arab politics. New political forces are going to have a say that they didn't have before. So we're likely to see things like, for example, on social issues, probably a retreat on things like women's rights to some extent. We're likely to see some excesses in economic policies. Everybody's going to want the state to just dole out money. In Jordan right now, the main demand is for a bigger public sector, for more state subsidies, for more state government jobs, and against kind of this neoliberal globalizing wave that has affected the nation. That may be good, that may be bad. It's up to I think the economists will know better, but economic logic won't be driving, I think, much of these demands. And you're likely to see excesses in foreign policy as well, at least initially. If the Muslim Brotherhood does get some say in Egyptian politics, what is its relationship with the United States going to be? What is its relationship with Israel going to be? Eventually, if we believe in the logic of state interests, of realpolitik, they will be socialized into the international system. But there will be a few hiccups and bumps, I suspect, along the road. But having said all of that, there's no going back to where we went before, because what we're witnessing now really is a revolution, and it is the beginning, the dawning of a new participatory age, good or bad. But we're now in a new phase in which the people are political players in a way that they haven't been so far. Where that's going to lead, what all these different dimensions of variation are going to mean, that remains to be seen. A combination of factors, including skill, including luck, will determine how quickly the Arab world will get there and how successfully it avoids detours or even catastrophic outright reversals.
Thank you very much.